He ruled one of the world's most isolated countries, but secretly obsessed over Michael Jordan. Kim Jong-il didn't just watch the Bulls, he rewrote the rules of basketball. There's a ton of weird stuff to talk about when it comes to Kim Jong-il, but here's one of the strangest. He was obsessed with Michael Jordan. Seriously. The guy loved Jordan so much that he supposedly owned VHS tapes of every single Bulls game. According to Kenji Fujimoto, Kim's former personal chef and later defector, Kim would host private movie nights where he and his close aides would sit around for hours watching NBA highlights. He saw Jordan as the perfect athlete, confident, charismatic, and completely untouchable, the exact kind of image he wanted to project as a leader. When the US sent him an Michael Jordan autographed basketball, Kim was apparently so thrilled that he built a small museum-style display just for it, basically a shrine to his favorite athlete. North Korean state media even claimed it was a symbol of mutual respect between great nations, though in reality, it was literally just a signed basketball, and because he couldn't just be a fan like a normal person, Kim Jong-il allegedly went on to invent his own version of basketball in the late 1990s, one he said would make the game more exciting and fairer for talented players. Under his new rules, slam dunks were worth 3 points instead of 2, shots made in the final 3 seconds were worth 8 points, and missing a free throw didn't just mean 0 points, it cost you points. These changes supposedly reflected Kim's personal philosophy: perfection must be rewarded and failure must be punished. According to reports, these bizarre rules were even taught to North Korean athletes as part of a so-called patriotic sporting innovation. Churchill really did enjoy being naked. Staff constantly stumbled upon him wandering around without clothes, and he absolutely insisted on staying that way. He often handled official business while nude or half-dressed, even in the middle of World War II. One of the most famous stories comes from when President Franklin D. Roosevelt unexpectedly walked into his bedroom at Downing Street. Churchill was standing there completely naked, puffing on a cigar, and without missing a beat, he said, "You see, Mr. President, I have nothing to hide from you." Aides and secretaries later joked that accidentally walking in on a nude Churchill was basically a workplace hazard. He believed it was perfectly natural, and he saw no reason to stop what he was doing just to put clothes on. Churchill also treated cigars and alcohol as his daily fuel. He smoked 8 to 10 cigars a day, sometimes letting them burn out in his hand just so he could chew on them. And yes, he really did drink constantly, but somehow stayed functional. His daily schedule practically revolved around it. Morning: weak whiskey and water, which he jokingly called his mouthwash. Lunch: champagne, usually Paul Roger. His favorite: afternoon: more whiskey or brandy. Dinner: wine, champagne, and yet another round of whiskey. When his doctor warned him that he was drinking too much, Churchill famously shrugged it off and said, "I have taken more out of alcohol than alcohol has taken out of me." Francisco Macias Nguema ruled Equatorial Guinea from 1968 to 1979 as the country's first president after independence from Spain. But instead of guiding his young nation forward, his rule descended into one of the most terrifying and paranoid dictatorships in modern African history. An era remembered for cruelty, suspicion, and strange, almost surreal, decrees that reshaped daily life into something nightmarish. Nguema lived in constant fear of being overthrown. In his mind, the greatest threat wasn't an army or a foreign invader. It was the educated teachers, students, and professionals became targets of his growing paranoia. Many were arrested, tortured, or executed simply because he believed they might challenge his authority. Soon he banned almost every form of intellectual activity. Books were burned, schools closed their doors, and even reading in public became an act of rebellion that could cost a person their life. Wearing glasses, something as harmless as that, became dangerous. To Nguema, spectacles were a sign of intelligence, and therefore of treachery. For countless citizens, a pair of glasses became a silent death sentence. His obsession with total control spread far beyond the classroom. Determined to keep his people from escaping, Nguema ordered the destruction of boats, bridges, and roads along rivers and the coast one by one. The pathways out of the country disappeared. Entire communities were cut off, trapped in isolation, forced into complete dependence on the very government that terrorized them. His paranoia knew no limits. It consumed ministers, advisors, relatives, even close friends. Anyone he suspected for any reason could be executed or exiled without warning. Nuema didn't just rule, he wanted to be worshipped. He viewed himself as a godlike figure, claiming mystical powers and acting as though he stood halfway between the living and the supernatural. He reportedly spoke to the dead, consulted astrologers, and relied on sorcery to guide his decisions. He adorned himself with grandiose titles like Unique Miracle, demanding that citizens bow or even crawl when they approached him, as if he were a divine being rather than a man. The cost of his paranoia and brutality was catastrophic. Historians estimate that up to 50,000 people, around 20% of the country's entire population, may have died during his 11-year reign. A nation that had once hoped for freedom after colonial rule instead found itself living through one of the darkest chapters in its history. Hitler often presented himself as the picture of discipline: no smoking, barely any alcohol, and a mostly vegetarian diet. But behind closed doors, he had one habit that didn't fit that persona at all: an almost uncontrollable sweet tooth. People who worked closest to him, housekeepers, chefs, aides, all described the same thing. He added sugar to nearly everything: tea, juice, and even drinks that weren't meant to be sweet at all, including wine substitutes and certain soft fruit wines. If it could hold sugar, he'd sweeten it. But why sugar? Historians have a few theories. A. Health and energy. Hitler reportedly struggled with chronic digestive problems, low blood pressure, and frequent fatigue. Sugar, being a quick hit of energy, may have been his go-to solution. His personal doctor, Dr. Theodor Morell, even gave him regular glucose injections, which Hitler jokingly called liquid candy. Adding sugar to his drinks might have been his own way of keeping his energy levels up throughout the day. B. Comfort and routine. He was also an extremely anxious and obsessive individual, especially as World War II dragged on. For him, sugar may have offered a small sense of comfort and predictability. He had a habit of stirring multiple spoonfuls into his drinks, and that simple repetitive motion might have been soothing during moments of stress or tension. C. Taste preference. On top of that, Hitler hated bitter flavors. He disliked alcohol unless it was sweet. And even the minimal wine he did drink had to be heavily sweetened. It didn't matter what tradition dictated, taste came first for him. Some historians think his fixation on sugar was tied to a deeper need for control. He denied himself meat and strong alcohol, but sugar was the one indulgence he let himself have, and one he could regulate completely. Interestingly, those around him noticed that his sugar intake spiked during periods of intense stress, especially in the bunker or during high-pressure meetings. That pattern suggests it wasn't just a preference, it was a coping mechanism too. In the end, Hitler's relationship with sugar wasn't just a quirky habit or a dietary preference. It was one of the few cracks in the strict, self-controlled image he tried so hard to maintain. A small detail, yes, but one that reveals something human beneath the propaganda facade. A man who relied on sweetness not just for energy, but for comfort, routine, and a fragile sense of control in a world he was rapidly losing command over. Sometimes, the smallest habits say the most. He took blood transfusions from young people to stay youthful. The idea that Kim Il-sung received blood transfusions from young people is one of those Cold War-era stories that spread widely, but there's no solid public evidence that it ever actually happened. Still, the rumor didn't come out of nowhere. Here's the background that explains why people believed it and how it became part of his legend. Kim Il-sung, 1912 to 1994, the founder of North Korea, ruled from 1948 until his death. By the 1970s and 1980s, he was already well into old age, yet North Korean propaganda continued to portray him as energetic, powerful, and almost ageless, the eternal president. Maintaining that image became a core part of the regime. Around this time, a handful of South Korean and Japanese newspapers began publishing stories, usually sourced from anonymous defectors, claiming that Kim's personal doctors were giving him blood transfusions from young, healthy soldiers to keep him looking youthful. The idea fit neatly into a long tradition of myths about authoritarian leaders trying to steal youth or vitality from others. Similar rumors had circulated about Mao Zedong and certain Soviet officials, so it was easy for people to believe Kim might be doing the same. Some of the more detailed accounts suggested the treatments took place at the Bonghua Clinic, an elite medical facility reserved for North Korea's top leadership. It was said that the clinic experimented with different anti-aging methods, though the exact details were always vague, typical of stories born in a country as secretive as North Korea. Because so little information ever left the country, even tiny leaks, whether true, exaggerated, or completely fabricated, often snowballed into accepted insider tales among foreign media. And since the North Korean regime focused heavily on portraying Kim as almost superhuman, outsiders were quick to imagine extreme measures being taken to keep him alive and looking strong. Cold War rivalries made this even worse. Propaganda flowed on both sides, and strange stories about the bizarre habits of enemy leaders were common. Some turned out to be true, many didn't. Today, most historians believe the blood transfusion story to be an unconfirmed rumor. However, it likely reflects a real truth about Kim's later years. His medical team was absolutely focused on prolonging his life. He reportedly received extensive treatments for chronic conditions like diabetes, heart problems, and arthritis. And despite everything, stressful leadership, war, and age, he lived to 82, which is surprisingly long given the circumstances. So while the tale of youth blood transfusions isn't backed by hard evidence, it sits right at the intersection of secrecy, propaganda, and the myth-making that defined Cold War politics. Ivana Trump, the first wife of US President Donald Trump, passed away in July 2022 at age 73. She was buried on the grounds of Trump National Golf Club in Bedminster, New Jersey. The New York Times, CNN, and BBC all confirmed the burial site through official records and statements from the Trump family. The reason given was that the Trumps wanted a private family burial site, and Bedminster was chosen because Ivana spent time there with her children. However, controversy and speculation arose online after reports that New Jersey law grants tax benefits to land designated as a cemetery. Some commentators suggested the burial could potentially confer tax advantages on the golf course property, though there's no evidence proving this was the motive, and experts have said the benefits would likely be minimal. Still, the idea took on a life of its own. Social media posts and opinion pieces began pointing to New Jersey's unusually broad cemetery tax exemptions, which can include breaks on property taxes, income taxes, and even certain business taxes. Because Trump has a long history of aggressively pursuing tax strategies, many people assumed this had to be intentional, but tax experts were quick to note that the rules are far more complicated than internet rumors suggest. A single gravesite doesn't automatically turn an entire golf course into tax-exempt cemetery land, and local filings show that Bedminster hasn't been reclassified as a cemetery in its entirety. What is true, however, is that Trump had expressed interest years earlier in establishing a small family cemetery at Bedminster, long before Ivana passed away. Local officials even approved a plan for a limited burial plot back in the 2000s. So while the timing stirred speculation, the idea wasn't new, and there's no confirmed evidence linking Ivana's burial to any tax strategy. In the end, the story sits somewhere between genuine fact and viral myth. Ivana was buried at the golf course. New Jersey's tax code really does offer unusual cemetery exemptions, and the situation created just enough overlap for people to assume the worst. But based on what's publicly known, the burial seems to have been primarily a family decision, not a financial maneuver, and any potential tax benefit, if it exists at all, would be marginal. If you think this was strange, trust me. History's full of leaders who did things even weirder than this.